My mother's had a comfortable relationship. Good evening, everybody. I think we're about ready to start now. Right. Good evening. I'm Hilary Ely. I'm the chairman of the trustees of the Cranston Library. Although I think a lot of you already know that. Right. Okay. Let's see if I can. Is that better? Can you hear me now? Excellent, right. Okay. So, it's lovely to see you all here this evening. Madam Deputy Mayor, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this year's Cranston Lecture. Welcome to all those here in person, and as is now normal, I'm happy to say, to those joining us online. And I've just been told that someone is joining us online from Kenya, so welcome to you too, especially. Once again, the lecture is being streamed to an online audience on YouTube, hosted by St Mary's Church. And we are grateful for this to St Mary's and to the technical support that we are getting this evening. The lecture will stay online as a recording, accessed by the same link as the live stream, which can be found on the library's website, for those who want to catch up later or watch it again. The survival of the Cranston Library has depended on people who have devoted long years to its care and who have built their knowledge and love for the collection over time. Sadly, we are facing the retirement of two long-standing trustees whose wisdom and dedication to the library will be hugely missed. Michael Henniker, whose term of trusteeship ended in September, has decided to retire. He first became a trustee in 2008. If you do not know him for any other reason, you will recognise him as the relaxed and charming MC of the Cranston Lecture in previous years. And this year I will attempt to fill those shoes, but I cannot hope to match his wit and urbanity, I am afraid. Michael has been a staunch supporter of all the activities of the library, with a particular care for our associates and friends, whose annual newsletter he has compiled and edited for many years. We will miss Michael very much, thank him for his years of service, and wish him well for the future. And tonight it is a great pleasure to me to welcome him as an associate. He doesn't get away that easily, and that's a way for him keeping a connection to the Cranston Library and us to him. Penelope Horsfall has also decided to step down as a trustee at the end of her current term of trusteeship, which is sometime next year. She and I became trustees in 1992, and we served our long apprenticeship in all things Cranston together. So it is impossible for me to imagine our meetings and events without her. Penelope's energy, curiosity, hospitality and enthusiasm, her lectures and her supreme networking have been a boon to the Cranston Library for over 30 years and counting. I cannot bring myself to say farewell yet, as she is here tonight, still a trustee, still working hard for Andrew Cranston's library and memory. But I will say a huge thank you to Penelope for everything you have done for the Cranston Library. As I am speaking of our trustees, one of our number, Nicholas Michaelides, is not well enough to be with us tonight, even though I know he would love to be here. I'm sure all here will join me in sending him our very best wishes. Last year, half of the Cranston Lecture was given over to a paper by Andrea Thomas on the two Ogilvy atlases, Africa and America. Her paper told the fascinating story of John Ogilvy and the publication of these spectacular atlases. And this was the context for an appeal for funds for the restoration of these two much-loved volumes in our collection, which had become too damaged to put on display. I am delighted to say that with your contributions last year and the generosity of a number of individual donors, the funds were raised, and now the two volumes have been expertly restored by Nick and Charlotte Cowlishaw and given protective book shoes to prolong their life. The atlases are on display this evening, and I hope you will come and admire them and the wonderful work and skill that Nick and Charlotte have put into them. This year I have to report an extraordinary gift to the library. Martin Higgins, who was our Cranston lecturer in 2010 on Betchworth Castle, among his many other claims to fame, has given to the library, free of all conditions, a collection of books found in a building during restoration work. It may be overdramatic to say that they were rescued from a skip, but that would most likely have been their destination if Martin had not spotted them and got permission to keep them. The books are old, rare, and important. Exceptionally, and after very careful consideration, the trustees have decided to add to the library's collection the works of St. Ambrose in 3 volumes dated 1516, and Juan Lopez, Compendium of the Works of the Church Fathers, 4 volumes in 2, dated 1622. Cranston's personal collection reflected a deep interest in the writings of the early Church Fathers, as well as the donated books he accepted and added to the library. And we feel entirely confident that if these wonderful books had been offered to him, he would have accepted them with alacrity. Even more fortunate, the works of the early fathers are well represented in the collection, except for St. Ambrose, so we've even been able to fill a gap. I need to make it clear that finding space for these volumes has been a challenge. The library is not actively adding to the collection, except when offered something directly relevant to Cranston or to Reigate or to academic research into the collection. And our standing policy is to turn down with thanks any offers of donated books unless these conditions are met. But these books are relevant and very special. On behalf of the trustees, I would like to thank Martin sincerely for his gift to the library and the generosity of offering it without condition so that we were free to make this important decision. Our body of associates is made of people who have made a special contribution to the Cranston Library, and I have great pleasure tonight in welcoming Martin as an associate. The story that these books have to tell could already fill the rest of the evening, and there is much more to find out about them, so I must leave the subject there. But I confidently expect a future Cranston lecture on this wonderful gift. Examples from each of these sets are on display this evening. I ask that you do please come and have a look at these magnificent books. A huge thank you as ever to all the people connected to the Cranston Library who make its activities and events like the Cranston Lecture possible. To our heritage volunteers for their care of the books and for making the records of what they contain. To St Mary's Parish Office for their support. To the parish teams who are supporting the lecture tonight with sound and vision and with catering. To the friends of the library who support us financially. And the volunteers who help with setting up and stewarding events. In particular, this evening, I would like to thank Derek Holmes, a long-standing associate, who has for many years been a mainstay of the annual lecture and other activities. He is moving away from Reigate. We will miss Derek very much and thank him for all he has done for us. Finally, thanks to all of you for coming this evening and for your support for the Cranston Library. If any of you wish to get to know the Cranston Library better or become more closely involved with the library, you will be made very welcome. Please speak to me or to one of the trustees. And so that ends my chairman's remarks. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Andrea Thomas. Andrea has been a trustee of the Cranston Library since 2001, and for many of those years she has been our much valued treasurer, and as you will know, a regular and always welcome Cranston lecturer. As an academic historian specialising in Scottish history, she is perfectly placed to help us to answer the intriguing question: how did Andrew Cranston, a Scot, come to settle in Reigate and make such an impact on the town? So for some insight into the interesting times making up Cranston's Scottish background, please welcome Andrea Thomas.
Thank you, everyone. Can you all hear me? Good. Excellent. Well, good evening to you all. A very warm welcome to the 2024 Cranston Lecture. Thank you all for coming. It's lovely to see such a big crowd. And a special hello to those watching online. So, yes. The Cranston Library, founded, as I'm sure you all now remember very well, in 1701, is, of course, named after its founder, the Reverend Andrew Cranston, Vicar of Reigate from 1697 until his death in 1708. And his initials appear on the door of the library chamber. Excellent. The details of his life are rather sketchy, but we know for sure that he was originally from Scotland. The surname Cranston derives from a small town in Midlothian, and between 1609 and 1869 there was a Lord Cranston within the Scottish peerage. It is possible that Andrew Cranston's family was in some rather distant way related to the Lords Cranston, because Andrew's nephew unofficially adopted their coat of arms. Or perhaps it was just wishful thinking. Sadly, we have very little other evidence of our Andrew's family background. We have no portrait, and we don't even know his date of birth, although it was probably sometime in the 1650s, because he was recorded graduating from the University of Edinburgh in 1673. He seems to have remained in Scotland throughout the 1670s and perhaps engaged in further study, we don't really know. And in 1681, he was appointed minister of the parish of Greenock on the Clyde. But he served only a matter of months in this post. He was clearly not happy, for in 1683, he made a gift, a remarkably generous gift, of 520 books to the Edinburgh University Library, and his deed of gift states that he was planning to leave the country. Shortly afterwards, he settled in England, and he revoked his gift in 1684 so that his books could join him in his new home. In 1687, he married Mary Williamson, the daughter of the then Vicar of Reigate, and he seems to have been firmly settled here, eventually succeeding his father-in-law as vicar in 1697. So it would appear that Andrew Cranston settled in England in his late 20s. The marriage licence says that he was about 27 years old in April 1687. I think perhaps he was a little bit older. And he died in Reigate in his late 40s. His grave is beneath the floor of the vestry behind me. And underneath the modern carpet is an inscribed stone attesting to his foundation of the library that bears his name. However, he was born, brought up, educated, and spent his early career in Scotland. And he clearly had a lingering attachment to his homeland, because in the inscriptions in several of the books in our collection, he described himself as Scoto-Britanni, Scottish-British. And I think this is quite a telling phrase. So what was Scotland like during the lifetime of Andrew Cranston? And what might have prompted him to leave his native land and settle in Reigate, to the very great benefit of future generations of this town? Well, first of all, there was a big discrepancy in the size and resources of the two countries, Scotland and England. At the end of the 17th century, the population of Scotland was roughly 1 million, and that of England about 5 times as many. The capital city of Edinburgh had about 40,000 inhabitants, when London contained about 400,000. The Scottish economy relied heavily on primary agriculture, selling hides, herring, woolen fleeces and such like across the North Sea and the Baltic, and importing luxuries and manufactured goods in return. There were many cultured and sophisticated Scots within the ranks of the nobility, gentry, higher clergy, universities, legal professions, and urban merchant classes. But they were few in number in comparison to the more numerous elites of England. The vast majority of the population existed at near subsistence levels in the countryside. This was true of the English rural poor too, but unlike Scotland, England was already developing a trading and manufacturing economy that exploited its expanding colonies in North America, the Caribbean, and across the globe. The emergence of the English Empire promoted the development of ports, cities, and wealth far larger and more diverse than any in Scotland. And the English merchants and parliaments ensured that most Scots were shut out of the English trade routes and markets through the Navigation Acts. Constitutionally, Scotland was a state separate from England, with its own long-standing monarchy, parliament, church, legal and judicial systems. The Kingdom of the Scots, originally known as Alba, was formed from the union of the Picts and the Gaels in the mid-9th century, and it successfully defended its independence from England right up until the lifetime of Andrew Cranston. Famously and somewhat fancifully depicted in the film Braveheart, King Edward I of England came very close to overrunning Scotland in the early 14th century, but a secure conquest slipped through the fingers of his successors. The Stuart dynasty of Scottish monarchs were the descendants of Edward II's nemesis, Robert Bruce. and in 1603, at the death of the childless Queen Elizabeth Tudor, the Stuart King James VI of Scots became King James I of England. His inheritance owed to the fact that King Henry VII of England, the first Tudor monarch, was James's great-great-grandfather. This union of the crowns created a rather uneasy and unstable relationship between two kingdoms under one king. James was very keen on promoting a closer union, and even commissioned some designs for a flag for his proposed new state of Great Britain. You can see there were several versions. But neither of his realms was willing to implement such a scheme at the time. So, James made the best of what he had, ruling both his kingdoms from Whitehall and relying very heavily on his Scottish Privy Council to act for him on the ground in Scotland. After 1603, he visited Scotland only once more during his reign, on the occasion of his Golden Jubilee as King of Scots in 1617. His son, Charles I, had been born in Dunfermline, but moved to England as a child, so had very little experience of his Scottish kingdom and even less curiosity. He visited Scotland only briefly in his reign. Once in 1633 for his Scottish coronation, and again in 1639 and 1641 for two unsuccessful attempts at crisis management at the start of the Civil Wars. By the time Andrew Cranston was born in the 1650s, there was a monarch in neither England nor Scotland. Charles I was executed in January 1649 by the English Parliament, which then abolished the English monarchy. The Scottish Parliament immediately proclaimed his son as King Charles II and crowned the young prince at Scone in January 1651. But the new king fled into exile following the defeat of his forces at the Battle of Worcester in September 1651. Oliver Cromwell's regime ruled England, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland with an iron fist and enforced a form of union between Scotland and England that was, in truth, a military occupation of the northern state by the English Parliamentary Army. However, the Cromwellian government fell apart during the brief and chaotic rule of Richard Cromwell, Tumbledown Dick, who had none of his father's skills or charisma, and the monarchy was restored to widespread relief and acclaim in May 1660. After his brief visit in 1651, Charles II never again set foot in Scotland, and nor did any of his Stuart successors as monarchs. Although the future James VII and II, 7th of Scotland, 2nd of England, was sent to rule Scotland as his brother's Lord High Commissioner, effectively a type of viceroy, in 1679, when he was still the Duke of Albany in the Scottish peerage. His English title was Duke of York. His court at Holyrood briefly became a focus for Scottish society and culture, and on balance, he did a moderately good job there. But his Catholic faith prevented most Scots from embracing him wholeheartedly. He succeeded his brother as king of both realms in 1685, and when he was deposed in 1688 by William of Orange's invasion of England, the Scottish Parliament endorsed the English arrangement for a Protestant joint monarchy of William and Mary. And thus, the so-called Glorious Revolution applied to both kingdoms equally. So, Andrew Cranston lived through the reigns of Charles II, James VII and II, William and Mary, and Anne, who was the last of the direct line of Protestant Stuarts. Tragically, Anne had 17 pregnancies, resulting in only 5 live births, and all her children died young. Therefore, the question of the succession was a very live issue during her reign, which commenced in March 1702, when our library was just 1 year old. By this time, both England and Scotland were firmly settled as Protestant states, and there was little appetite in either realm to allow anyone from the exiled Catholic branch of the Stuart line to occupy a throne or two. There was some support for the claims of the Catholic descendants of James VII and II, but Jacobitism was never really a majority movement, although it could be troublesome on occasions. However, there was a distinct possibility that if England chose one Protestant prince to succeed Anne, Scotland might well select another one. And the union of the crowns, which relied entirely on the person of the monarch, could potentially have fallen apart on the death of Queen Anne. This problem occupied the minds of senior statesmen in both kingdoms for many years, and the matter became urgent from 1700, when Anne's last surviving child died at the age of 11, and it became clear that she would have no more children. Without consulting the Scots, in 1701, the English Parliament passed the Act of Settlement, which decreed that after Anne, the English crown should pass to a German Protestant descendant of the daughter of James VI and I, the Electress Sophia of Hanover, and thence to her son George. The Scots, as you can imagine, were affronted and asserted their right to choose a monarch of their own. And so began a long campaign to persuade the Scottish Parliament to dissolve itself in a constitutional union with England, which would ensure that the Hanoverian succession applied to both realms. Popular sentiment in Scotland was hostile to the proposed union of the parliaments, and there were protests and riots at the prospect. There was some suspicion in England too, but Queen Anne and her government ministers were determined to push the measure through. Chief amongst their concerns was the prospect that a completely independent Scotland could become the means for an enemy power, which at this time basically meant France, to attack England by the back door. The Scottish Parliament did eventually dissolve itself into a parliament at Westminster, for the United Kingdom of Great Britain. And just by the way, if you're wondering, Ireland retained its own parliament until 1800, so almost another century. In January 1707, the Act of Union was passed in Edinburgh, in the Scottish Parliament, by 110 votes to 69. So hardly overwhelming, but a clear majority nonetheless. The English Parliament passed the measure in March, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland came into being on the 1st of May. The new Parliament of Great Britain met for the first time in October 1707. 16 Scottish peers, 16, joined 190 from England and Wales in the House of Lords, and 45 Scottish MPs joined the existing 513 in the House of Commons. So the Scots were heavily outnumbered. The Scottish legal and judicial systems and the Kirk remained separate from those of England, but new laws applying to Scotland had to be passed in Westminster henceforth. The union of the parliaments remained very unpopular in Scotland for many years to come. So why did the Scottish Parliament agree to the measure? Robert Burns famously said that the Scottish MPs were bought and sold for English gold, and bribery and patronage certainly played a significant part. But some payments to Scottish notables were arguably quite reasonable arrears of salaries and compensation for loss of office. Apart from the fears of a possible return of a Catholic monarch from exile, the main motivation for Scottish agreement to the Act of Union seems to have been economic. The Scots had gone through a particularly hard famine in the 1690s, from which they had not fully recovered. And because they were shut out of the English colonial trade, they had very limited opportunity for economic growth. In 1695, the Company of Scotland was established and had attempted to create a trading colony of its own in the Darien region of what is now Panama, which they proposed to name New Caledonia. The Darien scheme was funded almost entirely by Scottish public subscriptions, with many Scots, both high and low, sinking their life savings into the venture. It was a complete disaster. The plans had been hopelessly unrealistic, and the colony was abandoned by 1699. At least a quarter of all Scottish liquid assets, possibly more, were lost. The widespread financial hardship meant that capital for new investments in Scottish enterprises essentially dried up. A large number of the nearly £400,000 of compensation payments sent from England to Scotland in 1707 were used to bail out the distressed Darien shareholders and to wind up the Company of Scotland. Furthermore, the Act of Union included reciprocal access for Scottish and English traders into each other's domestic and colonial markets. In the long run, this did eventually promote Scottish economic expansion, but it took a couple of generations to take full effect. So, from his stable and comfortable home in Reigate, recognise the picture? Andrew Cranston would have witnessed the debate about and the accomplishment of the union of his two kingdoms in the early years of the 18th century. And one can only imagine that our Scoto-Britanniae vicar would have taken some satisfaction and encouragement from this turn of events. Nevertheless, he had left his homeland over 20 years previously. And to explain his departure, I think we need to remember that he was first and foremost a clergyman. I am speculating here, but I suspect that it was almost certainly religious tensions that drove him into exile. For the Scottish Kirk of the later 17th century was neither a stable nor a happy place. By Cranston's lifetime, the debate over the nature and organisation of the Scottish Kirk was no longer one of Protestant versus Catholic, but a dispute over what type of Protestantism should be enforced. Since all parties in the conflict claimed to have God on their side, the idea of making concessions or compromises seemed quite unreasonable, and opponents were invariably characterised as willfully defiant or downright evil. Servants of the Antichrist, lackeys of the devil. I'm afraid there was very little sign of Christian charity or humility in many of the church leaders of the period, and their antagonisms led to much suffering and considerable bloodshed. By the middle of the 16th century, there were two rival models of how a Protestant church should be organised. The one adopted by the Church of England was episcopal. The church was ruled by bishops appointed by the monarch. This naturally made the personal religious preferences of individual monarchs very important. The other, adopted initially by the Scottish Kirk, was Presbyterian, where the office of bishop, seen by some reformers as papist tyrants, was abolished. And the church was governed by a system of councils of clergy and elders, the presbyteries, which fed into a type of church parliament, the General Assembly. This made the Scottish Kirk much more independent of and potentially challenging to the power of monarchs. The system was introduced early in the reign of King James VI, when he was still a child. As an adult, he attempted to assert his own authority by superimposing bishops on top of the Presbyterian structure. This uncomfortable and controversial arrangement fell apart in the reign of Charles I and was one of the factors contributing to the outbreak of the Scottish Civil Wars. During the 1640s and 1650s, the Scottish Kirk once more rid itself of bishops, only to find them reintroduced again at the restoration of King Charles II. The price of Scottish support for the Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 89 was the re-establishment of Presbyterianism by Act of Parliament in the Revolution settlement of 1690, which was confirmed in the Act of Union of 1707 and is essentially the structure that governs the Church of Scotland to this very day. So finally, the pendulum stood still, having been swinging back and forth for a century and a half. Not only were the arrangements for governing the Kirk controversial, but there were also, you won't be surprised to hear, many doctrinal and liturgical disputes. The Scots seem to have had a talent for factionalism. There were engagers, resolutioners, protesters, Cameronians, and many other groups besides. Many of these groupings are broadly described by the umbrella term Covenanters, and the Covenanters in all their variety provided the strongest and most sustained challenge to the established Kirk at the time of Andrew Cranston. The Covenanting movement had its roots in the National Covenant of 1638 and the Solemn League and Covenant of 1643, both of which, in slightly differing ways, expressed popular opposition to the attempt by Charles I and his Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, to impose an Anglican style of worship on the Scots through the Scottish Book of Common Prayer of 1637. The use of the new prayer book sparked riots in many towns, and thousands of Scots flocked to sign a document called the National Covenant, a binding oath to God to defend his true Kirk. The Covenanting armies, and they raised armies very quickly, defied the forces of the king in the conflicts known as the Bishops' Wars in 1639 and 1640, and set the scene for the wider civil wars to come. In the 1640s in Scotland, the Covenanters themselves dominated the Kirk and the Parliament and rejoiced in their creation of a godly state. The secular powers were guided and constrained by dogmatic clerics, an episode which for a while was known as the Rule of the Saints. There was a concerted attempt to cleanse and purify the nation through the punishment of sinful behaviours such as drunkenness or fornication. Music and dancing, or really any kind of fun, was suppressed, and the prohibition of celebrating Christmas, which dated from the later 16th century, was fiercely enforced. So you weren't allowed to sing Christmas carols. Episcopacy, the bishops, were abolished, and only godly, covenanted men were allowed to hold any authority. This went so far as to regularly purge many organizations of those people deemed to be insufficiently committed to godliness. Even the covenanting armies were purged, by which they lost many of their most effective and experienced soldiers. Great. And thus allowed Oliver Cromwell to take control by conquest from 1650. After the Restoration, the sentiment of the Scottish political classes was strongly royalist, and the Scottish Parliament and office holders were remarkably accommodating to the wishes of Charles II. After his experiences in the civil wars and the Cromwellian period, it's hardly surprising that he felt the need to exert his own control over the state and the church to the fullest possible extent. The Restoration settlement in Scotland ensured that the traditional powers of the Crown were fully restored. The covenants were abolished, and all the Scottish legislation passed by covenanting governments was annulled. In 1661, all office holders and ministers of the kirk were required to swear an oath of allegiance to the crown. At this stage, there was relatively little bloodshed. Only a few of the leading Scottish opponents of the king were executed, chief of whom was this delightful chap, the Marquis of Argyll. In 1662, episcopacy was reintroduced, and all ministers of the church who had been appointed since 1649, that is the execution of Charles I, had to be reinstalled under the authority of the new bishops. Many moderate Presbyterians complied with the new requirements, but those who refused were ejected from their parishes. About a third of the ministry, some 270 clergymen, were pushed out of their jobs and, of course, their homes. The more hardline Covenanters opposed the Restoration settlement because they felt that they could not break their oath to God on pain of eternal damnation. So the movement went underground, or rather outdoors. In the 1660s, 70s and 80s, the more extreme Covenanters of several different factions absented themselves from regular church services and held their own illegal prayer meetings known as conventicles in fields, woods and hills. Conventicles sprung up in many parts of the lowlands. It wasn't really a highland movement, but in the lowlands. And they were particularly prevalent in the southwest, Dumfriesshire, Galloway, Lanarkshire and Ayrshire. In some places, the conventicles attracted crowds of many thousands, and they were served by charismatic, rabble-rousing field preachers who answered to no one but their own version of God. Many conventicles ran their own private armies to defend themselves from the forces of the law. They posed such a threat to the power of the monarch, parliament, and the state that the authorities were determined to stamp them out. Often, the conventicles and their leaders were attacked with brutal force, cut down in battle, executed in public, or sentenced to transportation. A major Covenanter insurrection, known as the Pentland Rising, was ruthlessly crushed in 1666. In the 1670s, the government tried a different tack, allowing a limited degree of licensed toleration under a system known as indulgences. But this initiative backfired because it effectively created a church within a church, and some of the radical Covenanters became even more extreme. In 1679, James Sharp, the Archbishop of St Andrews, was attacked and murdered by a band of radical Covenanters, and an armed rebellion followed, which was crushed in battle at Bothwell Bridge. 100 Covenanters were killed and 1,200 were captured, tortured, imprisoned, or transported. One of the ships engaged in transportation sank with further loss of life. I told you these were interesting times. This brings us to the early 1680s, when Andrew Cranston was briefly the parish minister at Greenock and then decided to leave the country and settle in England. Greenock was a very different place from Edinburgh, on the fringes of Covenanter country, very unsettled and divided. Cranston seems to have become disillusioned very quickly and just left his post. This is also the time when James, Duke of York, was sent to Scotland in large part to enforce law and order on behalf of his brother, King Charles II. He had a brief to stamp out the Covenanters and to enforce the Test Act of 1681, which was similar to the Oath of Allegiance of 20 years earlier. All holders of public office and ministers of the church were required to swear loyalty to the monarch as ruler of both state and church, and to sign on the dotted line. Many obeyed. Some refused and were persecuted. There is no record of Andrew Cranston having signed the Test Act. But since he swiftly left his post as Minister of Greenock, he would not actually have been required to. At this distance in time, it is not really possible to say whether he left his parish because he didn't want to sign the Test Act, or vice versa. But I suspect the latter. He later worked happily under the royal supremacy and episcopacy of the Church of England, so he was clearly no radical. In all likelihood, he just wanted to get away from all the strife into some peace and quiet. Just as Cranston was leaving his homeland, the Scottish authorities carried out one of their most savage campaigns against the more extreme Covenanters, an episode that has been dubbed the Killing Time. That tells you all you need to know. This concerted repression came close to extinguishing the most extreme religious radicals, known as the Cameronians. And Andrew Cranston must have been glad to have removed himself so far away from the conflict and bloodshed. By the time James VII was deposed by William and Mary, it was possible for the Crown to come to a reasonably amicable settlement with the moderate Presbyterians for another removal of the Scottish bishops in the settlement of 1690, an arrangement which was enforced by yet another Oath of Allegiance, which was confirmed in the Act of Union and has endured to this day. So, to conclude, Andrew Cranston's Scotland certainly encountered some interesting times. That's interesting in inverted commas. Of course, there was dissent, faction, violence, repression, and instability in England too at this time. It wasn't a paradise. But one cannot help but imagine that Andrew Cranston found refuge and sanctuary here in his parish of Reigate. It was certainly a place where he chose to settle. For a while, he did have an alternative, another English parish at Shepton Mallet in Somerset, where he seems to have lived and served as parish priest for a few years in the 1690s. But ultimately, he chose to settle permanently here. And here it was that he felt able to nurture his intellectual and philanthropic instincts through the foundation of his remarkable library. When Andrew Cranston founded his library here in 1701, he made a great effort to obtain donations from the local community. The trustees of the library today still rely on the generous donations of our supporters to maintain the library for now and into the future. As you have already heard from Hilary, last year we had a remarkably positive response to our appeal for funds to conserve the amazing Ogleby atlases, and we hope that you will feel able to offer us your kind support again tonight. If you are eligible, please do use the gift aid envelopes. And for those watching online, details of how you can donate will appear on the screen in the interval. Please give generously, and if you have already donated, thank you very much indeed. So now we will have an interval of about 20 minutes, and we shall reconvene at 8:45, if that's okay. There are refreshments at the back of the church, kindly provided, and the exhibition of the books in the chancel. But please don't take food and drink into the exhibition area. Thank you very much.
I've spoken about it. No, it's just Miles writing, so it's not escape. They do. I don't use it all the time. It's lovely to see you all. Yeah, of course, always. It's a lot of work, though, isn't it?
I'm not sure we did at school, but we did do a lot in the 18th century.
So to do it on Saturday was a bit
could I ask everyone to take their seats now, please? Thank you all for coming back so promptly. I know we've got some wonderful treasures on display, and we will be back after this next paper for you to have a further look. And also the library will be open then. If you've not seen it before, do pay a visit if you can. For our second lecture, I'm delighted to welcome Michael Beach to give our second paper. Michael has been a heritage volunteer with the Cranston Library since 2012 and is also an associate. He has been active for many years with the Art Society, formerly NADFAS, both in Reigate and at area level, and therefore a great supporter of the partnership with the Art Society that has brought the Heritage Volunteer Project about. Michael started in the printing trade as an apprentice compositor before moving into marketing as a career. Working as I do with Michael in our volunteer sessions, I know just how much inspiration he finds in the extraordinary skills and trades that come together in the production of the books in Annual Cranston's library. And this paper is the result. So please welcome Michael Beach.
Deputy Mayor, ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege and indeed a pleasure for a volunteer to have the ability, or at least the privilege, of addressing such a prestigious audience for one of the most prestigious annual events in the Reigate calendar. So to be a Cranston lecturer is probably all I need now before I come to my end. So thank you for inviting me. Oh, sorry, yes, already technology has beaten me. No, it hasn't. On the screen you see a familiar, I guess a fairly familiar sight. It is, of course, the Waterloo Mausoleum that lies just yards behind us here in the churchyard. Waterloo founded a printers in 1810. By the 1920s, was one of the biggest printers in the country. It's still around today, which is very rare for printers, and still specializes in security printing. Our local printer. And the reason I am here tonight is that I am also a local printer, although far from the glory and the fame of Mr. Waterloo. I began working life, as Hilary said, as an apprentice compositor with a company called McCorkadell's, then one of the biggest printers in the country, now hardly exists. I trained at the London School of Printing, and I left the industry shortly after becoming a journeyman compositor, as I thought then, I have to say, one of the few intelligent thoughts that I've ever had, that printing, with photo setting and early digital setting already arriving, was coming to an end 500 years after Caxton introduced it. A long-term volunteer with the Cranston Library, I've always enjoyed the sheer pleasure of handling and the delight of looking at the many books that live upstairs. And examples as they are of the craft, the art, and the technical knowledge of the people who produced them. Between the manuscript and the book on our shelves are a large number of craftsmen, artists, marketing people, and all sorts of others who make it possible. Now, having mentioned so often this major part of the production of the book, I've been persuaded to explore it further. So tonight is a brief introduction to the many skills that lie between a piece of paper, written by the hand of one of our authors, of course, and the beautifully designed and bound volumes that lie on our shelves. In the history of mankind, there are two major events that have progressed the development of the human mind: writing and printing, or more precisely, the invention of movable type that allowed more flexibility in the technique of printing. Many people suggest that the internet is the third big development, which oddly makes both writing and printing almost obsolete. That's life. I guess the two main names that we are all familiar with are Gutenberg and Caxton, the father figures of mass printing. We're going to take a brief look at the history of this art before we focus on the sort of 1650, 1750 period when the majority of the Cranston Library books were produced. Printing, the technique of producing many copies of the same image, had been around many centuries before Gutenberg and Caxton. It was widely used in Japan, in China, in Korea from about 22 AD, originally using, or as we see, carved wooden blocks on material as a direct decorative art. But by 650 AD, it was being used on paper for supplying information and illustration, allowing many, many copies to be printed quickly. But the process does not allow change. During the period of 650 to 750, Japan and Korea used the block and paper process not only to produce what they called information type material, sorts of books and documents, but increasingly intricate, complicated, and very beautiful designs, mainly on material. Woodblock art is, of course, still an established art form and is still widely produced. But the printing here is fixed on the original block. It needed movable type to be able to create books. And it was this that Gutenberg introduced to Europe. However, movable type was being used much, much earlier than Gutenberg in China. Between 1041 and 1048, a Chinese alchemist, Bai Seng, invented movable type made of clay, which could be, he handcrafted a mold, and after making the letters, baked hard the type, which could be used many times over. He noted that for a few copies, clay type was tedious and costly. But for hundreds or thousands of copies, it was fast and efficient, as Gutenberg proved 400 years later. There are still a few surviving copies of his 1193 dream essays, which we see illustrated here. So movable type in clay has started much, much earlier, because at the same time, also in China, a man called Wang Chen, an official of the Huan dynasty, invented wooden movable type, a material that Bai Seng had discarded as far too difficult, and indeed one of its problems was that the type is easily damaged, and every new letter needed to be hand-carved. But despite that problem, wooden typefaces continued to be developed widely in China, and even up to the modern day, like the middle of last century, in many remote provinces in China, wooden type was still being used. But in Europe, it was Gutenberg who invented the printing process based on mobile type. Born in Mainz in the early 1400s, he moved to Strasbourg about 1450. due to a bitter guild dispute he'd had in Mainz. He was interested in mechanics and secretly developed a method of making metal type via a matrix and a soft alloy, allowing hundreds of the same letter to be produced. But he also developed, which was very important, an oil-based ink that could be used on the pages of the metal type as a printing method. And he also developed a press, which he probably actually developed from presses that were used for wine and olives at the time. So you had a press, movable metal type, and ink, which allowed even impressions of text to be printed onto paper. Whilst all the elements of printing had been known for some centuries, it was Gutenberg who brought it all together and created an information revolution. Many copies of any text or idea were suddenly available to the whole population, or rather the population at that time who were able to read and afford available books. His most famous book, of course, is the Gutenberg Bible. Oddly enough, I was in the British Museum last week, and it's on its public display area, this very Bible. It's a wonder to see it. Gutenberg needed funds. He needed funds to allow himself to develop his own printing business and to allow himself to develop his own movable type invention, if you like. And he borrowed from various people, including a wealthy financier called Wilhelm I, who lent him 800 guilders. The Bible, Gutenberg decided, would be a bestseller. Turned out it was. And he very quickly repaid first and made a very large profit. So, to our own Caxton. Born in Kent in 1422, he was apprenticed to a man called Robert Large, a rich mercer who became Lord Mayor of London. When he died, Caxton moved to Bruges, becoming as a diplomat and a businessman, and became very prosperous, developing an interest in literature. Moving on to Cologne in 1471 too, he became interested in the new industry of printing, and he set up a company printing a number of books locally before he returned to London and to Westminster to set up his very own printing company. Now, during this time, he had an assistant, Vincomte de Verde. Now, de Verde seems to be a wonderful name for a printer. Vincomte de Verde, who, in time and with Caxton's blessing, left to form his own printing company. Now, there was only one place in London that he could afford, and that was Fleet Street, because rents were cheaper than anywhere else in London. And on top of that, there was a river, the Fleet, running by. And so he set up in this cheap part of London, and during his time there, he published some 488 books between 1493 and 1534. Soon, almost the entire body of London printers set up presses in Fleet Street, where the trade flourished until really very recent times. Because of the proximity of the printers, publishers also moved into the area. And by 1556, all of the 29 booksellers who lived around, 16 of which lived and worked in St. Paul's churchyard, just up the road from the printers, with 5 others in proximity and 8 within Fleet Street itself, all collected around this one area. For the next 150, 200 years, this small area was the home of publishers and printers. And as we know, many of the Cranston Library books were published in St. Paul's. The original reason being that Fleet Street was cheap and there was a river. Sadly, Fleet Street and printing has come to an end if you look at it now. Whilst London was building and creating a centre and industry for printing, The continent was also developing the crafts and skills of printing as well. Two major centres were Amsterdam and Antwerp. Plantin, a type designer in Holland, was significant in Belgium was significant in Antwerp. His ambition was to make his the greatest printing office in the world. By 1570, it was indeed a showpiece known throughout the continent. And some of the finest and best illustrated books in Cranston Library were printed in Antwerp and Amsterdam, leaders at that time of print technology of the period. The invention of printing not only created the possibility of mass education and the pleasure of reading, but it also created a whole new industry of craft. At the top of that was the typesetter or compositor, an artisan that demanded they be literate, as they had to be able to read, or at least able to understand handwritten text, a text that was for many years written in Latin, Greek, French, as well as English. So the compositor was a leading craftsman and became, in a sense, a quite separate part of the working group, sitting between the manual workers and the professional people such as lawyers, the clergy, and indeed authors. This standing was reflected in the training and the salary of the compositor. The trade of printing and indeed publishing was controlled by the Stationers' Company, which was formed in 1403, receiving a royal warrant in 1557. It held the monopoly over the publishing and printing industries. Regulation, discipline, and conduct were their keys. They held the copyright for books as well as training and entry into the printing industry. As mentioned, many books were printed in Latin, Greek, French, as well as English, so the typesetter had to be able to understand the character of a language, even if he couldn't read it properly. The apprenticeship for a typesetter at that time was 7 years, but often longer, sometimes up to 14 years. And a premium was paid to be an apprentice by parents or friends of the family, or sometimes by a charity. And this could range from £4, £900 today, to £105, £23,000 today. And we think that student fees are a modern phenomenon. Not so. An interesting side fact at the same time, in the same period, was that there were a number of women compositors, typesetters, from about the late 1600s. It's very difficult to find what the actual numbers are, but it certainly is a fact that there were a number of women compositors. How unusual must that have been at the time? A woman working in a high-grade craft. One assumes that the need for literacy and understanding words meant that women were accepted, even if under some sort of shadow, perhaps. But women compositors were there in 1600. And alongside the typesetter was another skilled and literate craftsman, the reader, who was often been a compositor previously, who had the very important role of reading the first printed draft and making any corrections needed to the spelling, the grammar, or missing words, and reading the revised draft to ensure that all was correct before the final printing. A pretty important job, as it still is. Printing then, and indeed always, I guess, was a closed shop, and was often actually a rather messy and stormy industry. In 1635, three men, Miles Fletcher, John Haviland, and Reuben Young, controlled all the production of print in London. They had no particular interest in developing printing. They had no particular interest in printing quality. They were much more interested in low costs and big profits. Now, I wonder where we've heard that before. Nevertheless, the trade was organised from the very beginning into the membership of what was called, and still is called, a chapel. This is mainly a relic of Caxton's Westminster days, And also, because of the importance of good light to be able to set type in, printers' premises with very large windows often reflected the look of a chapel. The chapel was from the very beginning, was a democratic organisation run by the members, and all of the members had to take part in every meeting and every decision. This is still the rule today. The head of the chapel was, and indeed still is, called the father of the chapel. And the rules about behaviour, employment, lateness, training, and other things were made by the chapel. And ritual too was important. For instance, at the end of an apprenticeship to a journeyman was celebrated by a quasi-religious celebration involving much drink and merriment, it is said. Don't get many quasi-religious celebrations doing that today, do you? And it was called, in fact, banging out. The typesetter and the reader were the highest paid of the print workers, an average of 3 shillings a day, which in those times was pretty high pay. But the work was always dependent on the work they had in hand. It could be paid as a weekly wage, but was often paid piecemeal, depending on the complexity of the book, its design, its size, its language, and so on. So, the printing industry was established with its rules, employment conditions, training, apprenticeships, all in place. From the early days, 1550 to 1650, printers had individual responsibility for everything. They had to cut the punches for the typefaces, they made the matrices, they produced the type, they made the ink, and often collaborated with the makers of the press. It was much later that foundries appeared to supply tape, type, and manufacturers of printing presses appeared. It was a model that was recognisable right into the late 20th century, and an industry that would have been very familiar indeed to the writers of the books contained in our library. 1650 methods were very little different to 1450 methods. Meanwhile, because of this major industrial breakthrough, publishers were also busy, collecting authors and titles that would appeal to the new reading classes. In the period of around 1600 to late 1700, a major seller, a major book title were plays, which became a regular part of every publisher's catalogue of the period. At the time, Drury Lane was producing about 60 pieces each season, and Covent Garden a similar amount, as well as other playhouses around the town, including, of course, the Globe. For instance, David Garrick, the famous actor, purchased 186 different play titles from a William Griffiths in 1768, all published and all printed. Between 1701 and 1750, 9,784 plays, collections and poems were printed in London. Plus, of course, fiction, such as Robinson Crusoe, Joseph Andrews, which among others sold thousands of copies. In addition to this, there was also published, of course, a very large number of religious, moral, and travel books, of which Mr. Cranston was very keen to bring into his library. To give an example of the publishing business at this time, here are the costings from the accounts of a publisher in 1735, costings that would be relevant to many of the books in our library. 300 copies of Mr. Pepys' work at £2, 2 shillings a sheet, £30, 9 shillings. Title in red and black, £1, 1 shilling. 2 reams of paper, £2, 16 shillings and threepence. A total cost of £35, 6 shillings and threepence. An average cost of producing 250 copies at that time was about £35 to £42. So that was the costings. We also have a good example of the pattern of cost and profit, coming in this case from the sale of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published in 1776 by William Stratton. Cost was 1,000 books at 16 sheets, £800. That's what it cost them. You deducted, well, that's what he sold rather at. Deducting from those sales were printing 90 sheets, £117, 180 reams of paper, £171, paying for corrections, £5, 5 shillings, advertisements, £16, 15 shillings. Total, £310 profit. A total of that was 310, a profit of £490, which in today's terms is about £89,000. So publishing could be a very profitable business with the right product, as always. So we looked briefly at the history of printing, its introduction to the UK, the emergence and importance of the printing industry, and the growth and financial success of the publisher. The world into which the books we have in our library were produced. But before we just consider the actual practical production of one of those books, there's another development that made an enormous contribution to the books that we have, and indeed to books and style in general, and that's type design. Caxton's Canterbury Tales, and indeed all of his books, were printed in a Gothic heavy black type style. Not surprising, since his source was Gutenberg in Germany, text, and of course the long history of manuscripts and the writing style used for them. Caxton even added colour initials to his chapter headings in the style of manuscripts. But Caxton also took note of the increasing art of typefaces and the introduction of the Roman faces. And indeed, he introduced Roman faces into his Gothic-style pages, often as headings, as we can see at the top of the second book. But given the continuing development of the metal-moving type and the method of moulds that created them, many people, particularly on the continent, began to take a serious interest in developing new and more artistic type styles in the Roman style. It became an art form of its own, and indeed still is today. The base of this was the skill of lettering developed over thousands of years, but now able to be translated onto a page in many sizes by the invention of metal type. From early 1400, artists began to design typefaces. One of the earliest was Aldus Manutius, who in Italy in 1493, designing the famous Aldus typeface, which is still with us today. In France, Claude Garamond was commissioned in 1540 to furnish punches for a series of typefaces, the most famous being Garamond, again, a typeface still with us. Whilst in the UK, William Caslon, who was born in 1693 and apprenticed to a gun engraver, leaving at the end of his time to establish a type foundry in London, and then creating the famous Caslon range, which was first used in the New Testament printing. His son continued to make and design type, including the well-known Caslon italic. All these faces are still with us. Another famous name, John Baskerville, began printing in the early 1700s. He was said to have never reused the type. As soon as he completed the printing of a book, he would melt all the type down so that his books were always printed with a new letter, he said. So by 1750, there was already a wide range of classical, baroque, neoclassical typefaces available in London to allow different design looks, patterns and styles which appear within the Cranston books and with which we are so familiar. Many of these typefaces created so long ago, such as Aldus, Garamond, Caslon, Baskerville and Dido, are as familiar to printers today as they were to printers 400 or 500 years ago. Indeed, they're familiar to all of us on our computer type list. Type design is actually a fascinating topic, and it probably, maybe it will, who knows, deserves a lecture all of its own. So, printer technology, craftsmen, designers, and materials were all in place and rich with diversity at the time that most of our books were printed, so that it allowed all of these skills and art to be employed in the books that we have, and which gives such a diversity and beauty to the books within our library. So let's now look at the skills and craftsmanship that were used to produce those books. The book we see is a couple of random books drawn from a shelf upstairs. Just look at its size, the complexity of its typefaces, decoration, margins, etc. And realize this was all done by hand. The compositor would read from the text and set it line by line. The three main factors in this were type, the stick, and the intelligence of the setter. Sorry, it's gone the wrong way around. The type was contained in what is called a case, which is with a space for every letter in a particular sequence. Originally, there were two cases, as we see in the first photograph. The upper case for the capital letters and numbers, and the lower case for the rest of the letters. This system started with Gutenberg and Caxton and continued right up until a single case, the one on the right there, containing both upper and lower was developed in America, we believe in the 1800s. It's this common case that is now the standard typesetting case everywhere. The typesetter used what is called a stick, we see them here, to assemble the type in lines, the stick used in early printing days being very similar to the stick used throughout the history of printing. The typesetter we saw of 1400s would be, or at least the typesetter today, would be as familiar with the stick the typesetter had in the 1400s as the stick he would have today. It hasn't really changed, except nobody uses it anymore, so we don't do typesetting. So it's been similar to throughout the whole history of printing. He would set the words back to front and left to right, several lines in a stick before moving them to a galley tray and slowly building up the work page by page. An average typeface size is 10 point. And we can see here what a 10-point letter looks like in reality and in the hand. So he is putting together tiny pieces of type like this, of individually, and then justifying by hand and by eye the length and the spaces he needs between the words. Every line obviously was the same length. And he's putting these all together in exactly the same length. Tiny pieces of lead that had no letter on them of varying thicknesses, which are called M, N, thick and mid-thin, are placed between every word. You can imagine how time-consuming and detailed this work would be. A compositor could set around 15,000 letters an hour, about 20 words a minute. A column of type might take 5 to 6 hours to set, but given decoration, initials, borders, the size of the page, etc., it could well take a day or more to set a page. There were other constraints too, in the sense that the case could only hold so much type, and you only had so much metal type available to you. So you could only set with what you had, which meant you often printed, say, 4 pages, or if you were very lucky, 8 pages. Then you had to redistribute the type back into the case before setting the next lot of pages. Several well-known phrases come from this period that we still use today, that come from this very lengthy and skilled process. Out of sorts means no more of a particular letter. Dis, breaking up the type and placing it in the correct compartments. Mind your P's and Q's. 2 letters in a case very close together, so you had to take care where you put them. Upper and lower case, obviously. Standard reference to caps and non-caps. Pages may well contain illustrations, which also have to be fitted into the page. Woodcuts in the early days were the most popular, and the only illustration indeed available in the early years. These blocks will be hand-carved, had to be exactly the same height as the typeface in which it sat. We see in our own library an enormous range of style, detail, beauty, and artistic quality of woodcutting. Often because of the size of a woodblock, they would be printed separately and stitched in at the binding stage. As the industry developed, other illustration techniques were also developed. Intaglio, an illustration engraved on copper plate. And there are many Cranston examples of this style. The problem was that the copper quality did not always print to the quality and depth of the text, which meant they were often printed separately to ensure an effective printed illustration. Many of the stitch illustrations in our book are copper intaglio plates. Additionally, you would have ornaments such as borders or usually initial chapter openings, and these sometimes would be made of small wood blocks, but would often be metal type from the foundry, and they needed to be fitted by the typesetter into the page he is setting. So it's easy to see why an average page would take 4 to 5 hours to set, but equally why many pages would take a day or more to set and prepare. Also, for many years, the setter would provide a key to how the pages of the book would collate finally. At the end of the page, you can see here, he would set the letter of the first word on the following page. Or quite often, he would set the entire first word of the second page. This meant that when the pages were folded, usually in the time of our books, in sets of 8 or 4 pages, the folder would understand the sequence, because you'd look at the left on this page and see it was up there on that page. There's a reason for mainly printing in 4 or 8 pages. The print range developed. In time, it became generally 16 or 32 pages. But at the period we're talking about, the printing presses would only be able to print in 4s and 8s, due to the size of the platen of the press. Another reason was type. As I said, it required a lot of type to set 4 to 8 pages. So they would prepare the 4 to 8, print, redistribute the type back into the cases, and then for the next lot. The pages, when setting was complete, were taken to what was called a stone. The stone here is in fact metal, as it has been for many, many years, which was literally a bench with an even and smooth top, where the pages were assembled into a metal, or in the early days, a wooden frame, called a chase, always in groups of 4 or 8. The spaces needed between each page and the size of the frame were filled with metal rods called coins and wooden blocks called furniture. The process was called locking up the chase, and it was now ready for the printer, a process that still is alive today where there are printers. The printing machines used at the time of Cranston's books would in the main be wooden screw presses, looking not unlike the wine and olive presses that had inspired Gutenberg. The size was approximately 5 to 7 foot long and about 7 foot high. It would be worked by 2 printers and an apprentice. Firstly, the chase would be lifted onto the base and ink carefully distributed evenly over the surface of the type using leather inking pads. This was a skilled process because the ink had to be absolutely even to get an even look when it was printed. And it was essential to have an absolutely even weight across the whole of the print area. Once inked, the pressman would place a standard sheet of paper, usually dampened, over the text, and then the bed would be moved along to stand under the platen using a windlass method, and the screw would be turned to lower the top and provide the pressure of paper onto the ink surface. Released, and the whole process would begin again with the next chase of papers. A printing team could generally print about 250 pages on one side in about an hour. In fact, the fact that a ream of paper, even today, consists of 250 sheets reflects this fact, that they could print about 250 sheets in an hour. The paper would be printed on one side, then dried on lines before printing on the other side, making 8 or 16 pages, and then passed to the binders. Ink in England had originally been, or rather in Europe generally, had been based on the oil paints used by artists. But printing ink needed to be much more flexible than that. And over many years, they developed an ink which could cover evenly all the whole page in a very even way and have a consistent black quality. So the pages looked exactly the same and had the same depth of blackness. And the ink now did all of that. Now the ink was obviously laying itself onto paper. As with many things, paper was invented in China, many years before the introduction of mass printing in Europe. By the 9th century, they would have spread to the Middle East and was known in England. Though the major writing material here then was parchment or vellum. But the rise of the printing industry from Gutenberg's introduction onwards meant that paper became much more important. The earliest attempts to manufacture it locally within the UK appears to have been made in 1496 by John Tate, again later become Lord Mayor of London. Tate had erected an early paper mill in Hertford, but lots of attempts were made before the art of paper making became successful, most notably by Sir Thomas Gresham, who set up a mill on his Osterley estate nearby ours. In the following years, from the late 1550s, we saw a growth in paper manufacture, with mills appearing in Buckinghamshire, Kent and Middlesex, among many other places. But despite this, in the period around 1670 to the late 1700s, a lot of paper, because of quality, was still imported. The manufacture of handmade paper has hardly changed from the early mills until today. Factory-produced paper is quite a different story and is much less relevant to Cranston books. The paper was, and still is, made from rags, made into a pulp and then spread over a frame and shaken in both directions to give an evenness and strength to the paper before it is slowly dried. The paper was made into sizes required to print 4, 8 or 16 pages. Sizes became standard, quarto, octavo, etc., to meet the needs of the printing presses, and the books obviously became standard sizes as well. The pages, when printed, were folded and bound together. Today, and indeed for hundreds of years, we accept that books are delivered with covers, bindings, and the content lies within. But at the beginning, this wasn't so. But as the printing of books increased, binding became ever more important. Size was a factor in ensuring that the weight of the books and the weight of the binding were compatible. By the late 1500s, the flood of books being produced was in fact creating problems for binders. The usual substantial manuscripts of the 16th century were sewn, rather like we see here, on heavy double thongs and then bound with a wooden board and clasps. Then came books on single thongs with rounded spines, pasteboard being used instead of wood, and silk ties rather than clasps. Then gold blocking was developed to decorate the spine and edging of the pages. Calf was the most popular leather used, particularly for decorative bindings, but sheep and deerskin plus vellum was also widely used. The early bindings were simple, but by the 1700s, the heyday of Cranston books, bindings became more ornate with fine finishes. Book binding became richer and more beautiful due to the patronage of the aristocracy and the gentry, the people who were buying books. Indeed, books were often left unbound and then bound to the taste and style and choice of the buyer when they bought the book. Book binding had become, as it still is, an art form of its own, with great interest in developing style and ornateness of decoration. Lines and decorations appeared using punches and gold foil. The type designer Aldous Madanaeus, who we've mentioned before, first introduced gold tooling to the covers. Often one binder would sew the book and encase it in a cover, which would be decorated by another binder. The heavy and cumbersome folios and quartos were competently and often quite beautifully bound, and decorated by men who were living in cramped, ill-lit conditions in small rooms of working-class homes, working maybe 6 days a week, yet producing work of extraordinary beauty. Additionally, end pages began to be decorated, often with marbled paper. The art of marbling dates back to Japan in the 10th century. Basically mixes a mixture of inks and oils, allowing the ink to float on water, into which paper is soaked, producing these beautiful results. In the 1500s, a similar process appears in Turkey, using paint rather than inks. Reaching the rest of Europe over the next 100 years, at a time when book production was a major industry, and the design of books, covers, end papers, and so on was of great interest. And the result we see in the many marbled end pages and book edges contained within Cranston's books. Marbling became an elite craft, and marble guilds were established. Apprentices were employed and sworn to secrecy about the technique and methods of their trade. This beautiful art form, of course, continues today, using very similar techniques to that used in Turkey in the 1500s. So we have considered how the book was set, how the book was printed, how the book was bound and decorated. But as with all products, there is one last factor. It has to be sold. In 1650, 1750, the period that most of the Cranston books were produced, there was in London mainly, but also in other provincial centres, many publishers. In London, the centre was St Paul's area for the reasons we've already spoken about, the establishment of printers in Fleet Street. The publishers would not only publish the books, but would also advertise, and as always, to encourage trade. We saw earlier the publisher setting aside £16, 5 shillings to advertise Mr. Pepys' book. They would also produce catalogues of books, of collections, as well as producing sales pamphlets for the season's publications, as well as selling their books in stalls and shops. And they would often include an advertisement in a current book for a future book. So promotion was an important part of the process and the last stage of the Cranston book. Within the Cranston Library, there are many, many beautiful books, with pages set to look interesting and are quite often small works of art of their own. None of this just happened. The space between the inspiration and thoughts of the author, finally written by hand on manuscript or early bought paper, and the often beautiful final product bought and put on the bookshelf, was filled by artists, craftsmen, artisans of great skill, all producing the final book. Between the manuscript and the bookshelf, there were, and still are, of course, dozens of people contributing to the final article. I hope that I've been able to show you a little of the range and the skills that these people brought to the production of the book. Indeed, the people between the manuscript and the bookshelf. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, very much indeed. Thank you for that very much first-hand account of how the books found their way from the inspiration of the author to the shelves of our wonderful library. And thank you too to Andrea for giving us a very, very plausible explanation as to why anybody would want to come and live in Reigate in peace and tranquility, surrounded by books and friendly people who were prepared to give them to him. Thank you both very much indeed. I have a small gift. For each of our lecturers with our Now, as I said, we will still be at the exhibition for a little while. The library will be open. If you haven't seen it before, then, please do pay a visit and see what all these books look like on the shelves. And can I please underline Andrea's message that it's your generosity that enables the library to survive and thrive. We thank you for it and ask you for more. But thank you all very much for coming this evening. And thank you to our speakers.